Notorious.
In Notorious.
Moi, c'est pratiquement le film que je préfère de tous les noirs et blancs.
Probably the picture which I prefer of all the black and whites.
C'est la quintessence d'Hitchcock,
it's
ça.
The quintessence of Hitchcock to me.
Il a une ligne très très pure.
And it has a very pure line.
Et la construction du scénario est formidable.
And the construction of the script is formidable.
C'est-à-dire le maximum d'effets avec le minimum d'éléments.
The maximum effect with the minimum of elements, of factors.
If you like the sort of things I like, the sort of unexpressed sexual lines running through it underneath the thriller, I was like a child. It was what I've been looking for all my life.
Once upon a time in 1946, Alfred Hitchcock made Notorious, known in France as Les Enchaînés, a love story woven into a spy drama. World War II is over. In a court in Florida, a Nazi spy is sent to prison. His daughter Alicia, played by Ingrid Bergman, has become an alcoholic. She is recruited by an American Secret Service agent, Devlin, played by Cary Grant. Her mission is to infiltrate a group of Nazis who have fled to Rio, among them Alex Sebastian, an industrialist working for IG Farben, who is played by Claude Rains. They are suspected of dealing in uranium, which they need to produce an atom bomb. Devlin and Alicia fall in love, but the American Secret Service force her to marry Alex Sebastian. The lovesick Nazi discovers Alicia's ploy. Urged on by his domineering mother, he poisons Alicia. Devlin saves her at the last minute.
The love story relationship involves this Secret Service man really, in a way, prostituting the woman he loves so that more can be learned about the Nazi plot. And she understands this, but she knows she's being used. And it brings a hostility into the love story that I think was very striking when the film came out, very new, and still looks special.
I suppose you knew about this pretty little job of mine all the time.
No, I only just found out about it.
Did you say anything? I mean, that maybe I wasn't the girl for such shenanigans.
I figured that was up to you, if you'd care to back out.
I suppose you told them Alicia Huberman will have this Sebastian eating out of her hand in a couple of weeks. She's good at that, always was.
I didn't say anything.
Notorious opens with the trial of a Nazi spy. The scene takes place in April 1946, evidence that the threat persisted after the war. In 1939, American fascists held a rally in New York to show their support of Hitler. But the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 pushed America into the war. Shortly afterwards, the FBI put on trial 33 spies found working for Germany on American soil. When Hitchcock began work on the script of Notorious at the end of 1944, World War II was not yet over. In Britain, where he was born, Hitchcock had already made 4 films dealing with the rise of Hitler, among them The Lady Vanishes. In Hollywood, he followed them with 3 films that were all strongly anti-Nazi: Foreign Correspondent, Saboteur, and Lifeboat.
Hitchcock had been thriving in the English film industry, making comedy thrillers, very tight, very cheap films by American standards, suspenseful, but with that Hitchcockian air of comedy in them. Very, very well made films, very tightly controlled films by the director. And Hitchcock, who had begun as a graphic artist, that was his sort of his training, was a visualizer. He was one of the great directors of all time, I think, at visualizing shots.
The medium of pure cinema is what I believe in. The assembly of pieces of film to create fright is the essential part of my job. Just as much as a painter would, by putting certain colors together, create evil on canvas.
My grandfather was known for his just extraordinary imagination, and I don't know, you could say he was pretty much a loner as a child, and he became very involved and loved the movies and loved going to the movies. So, you kind of wonder if all that, because he was alone so much, sort of fueled the imagination for him. But his imagination was incredible, and his wit and sense of humor were so quick that some of that I'm sure is just you're born with, but I don't know. I think a lot of it was just his early childhood maybe, and his creativity for just being by himself a lot.
You always pick very beautiful women for your pictures. Were you a ladies' man, or were you a shy chappie with the ladies? You were a loner.
In 1939, Hitchcock arrived in Hollywood with his wife and collaborator, Alma Reville. He was 40 years old, with already 24 films to his credit. David O. Selznick, the producer of Gone with the Wind, had offered him a contract, as he'd also done for Ingrid Bergman, a 23-year-old Swedish actress whose mother was German. Selznick suggested changing her name to something more American, but she refused. Rebecca, Hitchcock's first American film, won the Oscar for Best Film of the Year. His next collaboration with Selznick was on a film about psychoanalysis, Spellbound, with Ingrid Bergman. The script was by Ben Hecht, a New York Jew, a successful dramatist, and one of the most famous Hollywood screenwriters. His best-known work included Howard Hawks' Scarface and William Wyler's film of Wuthering Heights. He and Hitchcock wrote Notorious together.
Ben Hecht was a fervent Zionist. He was very much aware of what was going on in Europe during the war in terms of the genocide. There's a memo where David Selznick said, "Had lunch today with Ben Hecht and 2 million dead Jews," because Hecht couldn't shut up about it, while people in Hollywood were somewhat inclined to steer away from it, certainly Selznick. And Hecht brought all of that into the writing of Notorious.
David O. Selznick had bought the rights to a newspaper serial from the 1920s, in which an actress is persuaded to sleep with an enemy spy. This story was indirectly inspired by a real-life French woman, Marthe Richard, who during the First World War was obliged to use her charms for the benefit of her country.
Hitchcock est parti de l'histoire de Marthe Richard. Il a raconté à Ben Hecht, il y avait une espionne pendant la guerre de 14 qui était une pute. Alors c'est parti de là. Alors ce qui est drôle, d'ailleurs, c'est que Marthe Richard ensuite a fait fermer les bordels. Elle voulait plus travailler. Oui. Enfin, bref, toujours est-il que... non, ça, je suis formel, c'est d'après Marthe Richard, je la tiens de la bouche du cheval.
When the United States joined the war at the end of 1941, the American government used Fort Hunt, south of Washington, to interrogate more than 3,000 German prisoners. Among them were many scientists and experts in ballistics and atomic research. Warned by Einstein about progress made by the Nazis in experimenting with nuclear reactions, the American leaders wanted to know just how far they had progressed in creating weapons of mass destruction. From 1942 onwards, American, British, and Canadian scientists worked together in New Mexico on the Manhattan Project. By the beginning of 1945, 3 nuclear bombs were ready. The first one was tested in July in the American desert.
The atomic bomb was one of the great secrets of all time, but it wasn't completely secret. I think people had heard about some project being in development, and this is not just the matter of a high secret being leaked. Part of it is, I think it was people's worst fear, and there were certainly reports about the project to create this super bomb that would serve the United States and the Allied interests, that would end the war and would be a deterrent to future wars. Hecht, who had his ears to the ground, and Hecht, who was very much involved with keeping up with the war effort, and I think he certainly had his sources in Washington. Nobody has ever accused Ben Hecht of not being in the know. It's quite likely that it was Hecht who came across this, but Hitchcock and Hecht collaborated on building it into the film.
And I thought of the idea they were collecting samples of uranium-235, from which the future atom bomb would be made.
Got vintage sand. We've got to leave things as we found them. Help me find a bottle of wine with the same label as these others.
But it isn't really sand, is it?
I think it's some kind of metal ore.
Ben Hecht and I went over to
Ben Hecht et moi-même, nous avons été voir
at Caltech, which is the big Institute of Technology of California, at Pasadena, to meet Dr. Millikan.
Pour rencontrer le docteur Millikan.
At that time, the leading scientist in America.
À ce moment-là, le plus grand scientiste de l'Amérique.
And we were shown into his office. Our first question was,
première question a été,
Dr. Millikan,
Dr. Millikan,
how big would an atom bomb be? And he looked and said, do you want to get arrested?
Voulez-vous faire arrêter, il nous a dit.
Do you want to get me arrested?
Voulez me faire arrêter, moi?
And then he spent an hour telling us how impossible it would be.
Et il a passé 1 heure à nous dire à quel point ce serait impossible.
He loved telling the story that after that, he was followed by the FBI. And he knows he was on the FBI's list as a potential, they didn't know, spy or whatever. But to him, that was very exciting.
In August 1945, the first atom bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. The nuclear apocalypse did not provoke the expected reaction. Japan surrendered only after a second bomb devastated Nagasaki. As the Allied forces invaded the territories occupied by the Nazis, they discovered the true horror of the concentration camps. In Poland, the Red Army liberated camps built for the extermination of Jews and Gypsies. In the summer of 1945, Hitchcock traveled to London to supervise the editing of a film called Memory of the Camps. It consisted of material already shot by the Allied armies. The documentary was specifically intended for showing to the German public.
The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourself, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictured in the paper, cannot describe it at all.
He specifically wanted to put these bits and pieces of newsreels taken by various on-the-spot documentary photographers. He wanted to put them together in a way that people would not only be shocked by them, but in a way that they would believe them. He wanted to use long takes. He wanted to create a sense of the realism of these things so that they would be burned in people's minds.
He said all his life he was tortured by what he saw, but he didn't regret doing it. It was so important. And he felt, and Sidney Bernstein, who was heading the British Office of War Information, wanted him to do it. And they thought that if Hitchcock's name was on it, it would mean that people would really see it.
In the summer of 1945, Hitchcock worked for a month on Memory of the Camps. Back in Hollywood, he learned that the film would never be shown. The British government felt it would demoralize Germans in the west of the country, especially as the east was occupied by the Red Army. A version of the film was finally shown on television in the 1980s, in the USA, Britain and France, after Hitchcock's death.
I think the impact of seeing the death camp footage on a sensitive man like Hitchcock, looking at reel after reel after reel of it, and then going back and shooting Notorious shows up in another way. And this could just be my fancy, but the wonderful photographic style of Notorious is very dark. There is a lustrous darkness to this movie, which is the first thing one thinks of when one thinks of Notorious. And I think that darkness is something that the director just carried back in his heart from his experience of working on Memory of the Camps. I think the Memory of the Camps is in the film, but it's in the film everywhere.
In spite of constant revisions to the script of Notorious, David O. Selznick remained unconvinced by the idea of Nazis developing an atom bomb. He was also seriously distracted by his own superproduction, Duel in the Sun, which was going well over budget. Selznick decided to sell Notorious to RKO Studios as a package, including Alfred Hitchcock, the script, Ingrid Bergman, and Cary Grant. Thanks to the deal, the British director won his artistic freedom. RKO specialized in well-crafted B-movies shot in lustrous black and white. The studio's productions included the musical comedies of Fred and Ginger, as well as King Kong and Citizen Kane. Greg Toland, the cameraman responsible for the deep focus photography in Orson Welles' film, shot location backdrops for Notorious in Rio. Hitchcock and his cast never left California.
Mother said that he was different than working with other directors because of his camera move. Sometimes an actor had to walk from here to there. Sometimes actors, you start the morning by going to the set and you rehearse the scene. And often it's the actor that decides, okay, I'm sitting there and I'm walking over there. And the director might say, well, I would prefer if you go from here to there because the background is better. But you couldn't do that with Hitchcock because a lot of it was planned with the editing and the camera move. But Mother loved it.
Feel better?
What do you care how I feel?
Everything is decided on paper. I do not improvise after the picture's finished, or very much while the picture is being made. A little bit is permissible, but if you don't make your picture on paper ahead of time with all the desired effects, if you cannot visualize or hear, then this would be like a musician composing with a full orchestra in front of him. So he's got his blank music and saying, flute, give me a note, will you please? And the flute gives him, thank you very much, and he writes it down. There's the comparison. I think the film should be made on paper ahead of time.
What I discovered working on Notorious and looking at the way it grew while it was being shot was that for Hitchcock, the shooting of a film was not simply the recording of something that already existed in the form of script and storyboards. In fact, I never found any storyboards for Notorious. The truth of the matter is that except for action sequences where they were needed, he rarely followed storyboards and often didn't have them. And that effect of precision comes from his having a brain approximately as complex as the computer platform for CGI work, and an incredible eye, which enabled him to put something on the canvas, erase it, go back, put something else 3 days later, then add something over here that would balance it, and so on. That's the way Notorious was made. And the effect is of great precision, but the precision was in the result, not in the process. There's a shot on the plane going into Rio where Grant is sitting next to Bergman, and she looks out the window to see Christ of Cordovero, and he's looking at her. And at that moment, an unguarded moment for Devlin, uncharacteristic of this very controlled guy, we see that he's falling in love.
Yes, oh yeah.
And that was actually shot twice. It was shot, then he went and shot a rather cold scene between them in a restaurant in Rio. And then he realized he needed something to signal to people before that underneath his stern demeanor, Devlin is in love with Elsa. And so he went back and reshot the scene on the plane. And this was really Hitchcock's way of discovering the film he was making in the process of making it, and it's why it's one of the great Hitchcock films.
Hitchcock said Notorious had the fewest mistakes, which is something Billy Wilder would always say about The Apartment. And when a picture turned out really well, he wasn't likely to say, oh, it was a great success, although he did sometimes say it about Shadow of a Doubt, which was personally very dear to his heart. But he would speak about Spellbound and Notorious often in terms of Ingrid, and what a joy it was to work with her, and what a perfect actress, and what a beautiful person, outside and inside.
Hitchcock used to be wonderful with me because he used to listen to all my arguments, and you thought you'd had him. He didn't answer, just sit there and listen and listen and listen. And you said, I have got him now. He's on my side now. And then when you finished, he said, I get your point. Now do exactly what I told you to do and fake it.
Where are you going?
If you're going to stay in, I have to telephone the hotel, see if there are any messages.
Hitchcock was very clever and invented a love scene with a kiss that became famous in those days. But a kiss couldn't last more than 2 seconds, I think it was. It had to break.
This is a very strange love affair.
It couldn't be in a horizontal position, even with clothes on. And he invented this thing that they tried to cut, but he won because not one kiss was longer than 2 seconds, but there were so many of them, you see.
When I don't love you, I'll let you know.
You haven't said anything.
Actions speak louder than words.
It's a lovely scene, and they played it so well. And it's harder, I would imagine that scene is harder than a long kiss, because you have to have much more intimacy or friendship to do a kissing and nibbling and playing around when the other person, like two lovers really do. And they did that scene, but Hitchcock really did it because he wanted to piss off the censorship. And it turned out to be one of the, I think, one of the most tender and amusing loving scene in films.
I asked Hitch why he had decided to do it in one shot. And he told me this elaborate story about being on a train once, somewhere in Europe, and watching a couple, arm in arm, walking in the fields. And at one point, the young fellow stopped to urinate against a tree. And his girl didn't let go of him, you know, looked down occasionally, see how he was doing, and never let go. And I thought, there you are, you see, love cannot be interrupted, even by urinating. So I thought we'd do the whole thing in one shot. The fact that he was on a train when he saw that indicates a certain dolly shot.
Hitchcock later said that in a shot like that, or a scene like that, there are really three characters. There are the two people that are kissing, and then there's the camera or the director watching this. Well, what is unusual there is that the stone face of the director has been digitally pasted onto the actor. That is the impassivity of the director watching the kiss and empathically participating in it, because essentially the story of Notorious is contained in that shot. A man who's in love with a woman throws her into the arms of another man and watches while she marries him, makes love with him, and so on. Not literally watching them make love, but that's what Hitchcock is doing in the kissing scene. And this is a kind of primal scene for Hitchcock in both senses of the word, because it's the little boy watching mother and daddy do it.
It's a very complicated love story because Cary has a great dichotomy of how he feels about her. He's torn between wanting to believe that she's a whore and wanting to believe that she's not. It sort of tears him apart. It's not an uncommon emotion in men about women.
Listen, you chalked up another boyfriend, that's all. No harm done. I hate you. There's no occasion to. You're doing good work. Number 10's out in front. Looks as if Sebastian knows how to pick 'em.
Is that all you have to say to me?
Dry your eyes, baby. It's out of character. Except keep on your toes. It's a tough job we're on.
He's very cruel to her, and he keeps testing her. He keeps testing her to see what she'll do, and she doesn't want to be tested, really. I think it's unquestionably the darkest characterization of Cary Grant's career. I mean, I don't think he ever let himself get that dark again.
Born in England, Cary Grant played in variety shows there before becoming one of the greatest Hollywood stars, loved for his comic roles in Leo McCarey's The Awful Truth and Howard Hawks' Bringing Up Baby. In Suspicion, made in 1941, Hitchcock revealed a disturbing ambiguity in Cary Grant's persona. Notorious continued to explore this aspect of his character.
Cary Grant could do light comedy, but he could also do tough stuff, and this is a sort of perfect balance. Only someone who could do light comedy could have done the scene with the kiss. But of course, at the same time, he's playing it with tremendous depth of feeling. So it's a brilliant juggling act.
Grant and Hitchcock were both English. They understood each other, and I think one of the reasons Hitchcock was so fond of Grant was that he was the first American movie star to commit to do a Hitchcock picture. And the reason Hitchcock used to give for that was because Cary, being English, didn't look down his nose to crime melodramas, which have a accepted and praiseworthy place in English letters, whereas in America they're sort of thought of as common. I remember once I said to Cary Grant that I liked Notorious very much, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's the one Hitch threw to Ingrid. He always threw the picture of the girl if he could." So I thought it was a very interesting remark. He always threw the picture of the woman if he could.
The reason why in this role Mother excels is, first of all, if you're happy on a set and you feel comfortable, you're free. So she already worked with Hitchcock. She became friend with Hitchcock. She felt very comfortable. There was obvious chemistry with Cary Grant. And she could play what she had that I think is this combination of a strength and an incredible innocence. And that is the perfect combination for the role. And this role also offered that quality of being a little bit spunky and intelligent, but at the beginning she's sort of a spoiled little child, you know, and then she's growing into being a woman. And this is very much who she was.
If you look at Bergman's career as a whole, she is, when young, this extraordinarily beautiful, lyrical, life-affirming force. And yet, her great performances are very often of women whose life is darkened by guilt, by anxiety, madness even. And the later film she made with Rossellini, when she left Hollywood, Rossellini saw that edge of guilt and darkness very well and exploited it. And this is a film in which she's a degraded character in a lot of ways, and she feels it. And the film rescues her. It's one of those Hitchcock films where rescue is the thrust, although the rescuer is maybe not the ideally sympathetic rescuer you might like. He's got his own darkness, and if you think about the relationship those two characters are going to have after the film is over, it may not be the sweetest and tidiest of all time.
On the 20th of November 1945, while Notorious was being filmed, the Nuremberg trials began. 25 leading Nazis were tried for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Other Nazis, such as Adolf Eichmann, who devised the final solution, and Joseph Mengele, the SS doctor based at Auschwitz, fled to South America, passing through Franco's Spain. This was a journey predicted by Hitchcock and Hecht in the screenplay of Notorious.
Miss Huberman? Yes. Please forgive me for keeping you waiting. Not at all. You resemble your father very much. I'm Alex's mother. I knew when I saw you. Alex has always admired you. Now at last I know why.
The film has one of Hitchcock's great mother figures, and he specialized in them. And Psycho is the sort of locus classicus of this, but he had very ambiguous feelings over mothers. And the mother in Notorious is the mother to the villain, and she's extremely protective, even to the point of being crushing. And there are moments where you realize that this mother, who obviously loves her son in many ways, she's also in love with causes, the Nazi cause, so that she may have to destroy him too. As to the reason or what lies behind Hitchcock's sense of motherhood, you have to wonder what it meant in terms of his own life. I don't think we don't know enough about his own life, and he certainly didn't reveal it. But I think there's enough in the films for one to speculate that he had a confused feeling about his mother, yes. But a lot of people do.
My great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, was, I never knew her. She passed away before I was born. But she, from what we had heard, he was very close to her, and she was a good mother, but she was a domineering personality. And you tend to see that in some of his movies where, like in Notorious, the mother, Psycho, but, you know, obviously she was not like Psycho. And North by Northwest is also the mother who plays a big role in their life, sometimes not always the best thing in the world, but that you listen to no matter what.
If you pay attention to characters smoking, it's a wonderful touch. And if you're alert to it, it becomes almost too telltale and too obvious. the bad guys and the characters when they turn bad, like the Devlin character, when they pick up a cigarette, watch out. Now, smoke in a Hitchcock film is a wonderful visual touch, and he uses it very, very effectively in this film.
De temps en temps, il fait un truc très astucieux que j'ai piqué à mort. Il fait un truc très astucieux, c'est d'utiliser ces objets signes comme signes d'éléments de l'intrigue, pas de l'intérieur des personnages, de l'intrigue. À partir du moment où le spectateur est habitué à ce que l'objet ait un rôle dans l'intrigue, un rôle souligné dans l'intrigue, il finit par comprendre que parfois, quand ça n'est pas dans l'intrigue, ça doit bien vouloir signifier quelque chose ailleurs.
Within a minute.
Darling. It's not that I don't trust you. But when you're in love at my age, every man who looks at your woman is a menace. Will you forgive me for even talking about it? I'm very contrite.
Really, what he's doing in all his films is teaching us how to look, shaping our gaze, and he's teaching us to see things that are they're like clues, but they're more like incriminating elements and things that someone is guilty to possess because they give away so much. He's wonderful at finding those things in natural behavior and just exaggerating them a little bit.
I love this. His description of going for the key to the wine cellar. They built an elaborate wooden crane in order to make the camera come down to that key in her hand. And I asked him why he'd gone to such lengths to do that shot. I mean, it could have been done a number of different ways. You could just show a wide shot and cut in closer and then cut to the hand. I mean, could have been done very simply other ways, but why did he do it that way? He said, well, that's a cinematic way of saying in this great party, this great hall with a lot of people, a lot of hubbub, the whole thing comes down to a small key in somebody's hand. So it's a way of visually saying that. It's like a paragraph in a story, in one shot. It's a model of filmmaking, storytelling in movies. It's an exceptional shot because it gives you suspense, because the fact that the camera is moving, even though the audience perhaps isn't conscious, they're aware that something's happening and they're being taken somewhere for a purpose.
One of the most essential things in a film is visual clarity. I think an audience should be given all the facts. For example, if you take suspense, suspense can only be achieved by telling the audience as much as you can. I don't deal in mystery. I never make whodunits.
No.
Because they're intellectual exercises. You're just wondering. You're not emoting.
Someone is coming. It's Alex. He's seen us.
Wait a minute. I'm going to kiss you.
No, he'll only think we...
That's what
no.
I want him to think. You'd better stay upstairs, Joseph. They may need you.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Dad.
Push me away. I'm sorry to intrude on this tender scene.
Hitchcock builds up suspense on an emotional level. Not bombs, but poison. Not bombs, but the complexity of their relationship. Will they have a breakthrough? Will he be able to say, I love you? Will she be able to transform herself from the party girl to the true-hearted, complete woman that we know she has it in her to be? That's where the suspense is, and Notorious is a masterpiece of that kind of emotional suspense.
No room, Sebastian.
Oh, you must take me. They're watching me.
That's your headache.
Oh, please take me, please. Please, please.
There is no telephone in her room to call the hospital.
Alex, will you come in, please? I wish to talk to you.
The real thing is why Claude Rains decided to play it sympathetically. In other words, he was the villain, he was a Nazi, and he chose to play it on this very, you know, on a level that you wouldn't have expected. You'd expect him to play it as a sort of horrible fellow, but actually he was very sympathetic, and so that when, as it were, Bergman is betraying him or exposing him or whatever, you feel rather sorry for him. And when he has to go and face his terrible mother and those dreadful people at the end, it upsets you. So it's much more... It's more to do with emotion than you would expect a film like that to be about.
The film ends in a way that we want to believe is the triumph of love. The man is transformed by love, the woman is redeemed by love, and they ride off, presumably happily ever after. But there are a couple of things that maybe undermine that. First of all, there's the 105 minutes of the film that come before that, and those crises and those difficult moments are absolutely unforgettable. And then there's the reminder, of course, that the very ending of the film is, let's say, that nasty business of Claude Rains walking back into the house. And that's kind of one of the byproducts of the triumph of love, facing certain extinction at the hands of his erstwhile friends. So it's quite a problematic view of love. A triumphant love story, to be sure, but a problematic analysis of love also.
Notorious was released in the USA in August 1946. It was one of Hitchcock's greatest financial successes. The film was shown at the Cannes Festival in September 1946. The revived festival championed filmmakers on the winning side of the war, from Roberto Rossellini to David Lean, and included films by René Clément, Billy Wilder, and Alfred Hitchcock. Notorious failed to win any prizes. When Notorious opened in France in 1948, the publicity claimed it featured the longest kiss in the history of cinema. Most critics only regarded the film as a fine piece of entertainment.
J'ai vu le film pour la première fois quand il était sorti et j'étais complètement ébloui, quoi, mais vraiment complètement ébloui. Et je me suis... Bon, alors, quand on a 17 ans et qu'on veut faire du cinéma, on se dit quels cons ces critiques, ils n'ont rien compris, moi je comprends tout et tout ça. Et heureusement, c'est... Bon, ça... j'ai trouvé des gens comme moi, Truffaut, Rivette, tout ça, ils étaient de mon avis, donc on a fini par s'agglutiner. Hitchcock pour beaucoup, a été une espèce de catalyseur pour les gens de la nouvelle vague. Il faisait vraiment partie des gens qui étaient les piliers. Renoir, Hitchcock et Hawks.
Well, that was the great thing about the French. They didn't allow subject matter, genre subject matter, to deflect them from seeing what was really going on in a movie. And Hitchcock had impeccable technique, but he also had something going on underneath. And you don't see a movie with that kind of dark relationship very often. Even serious, quote, serious films don't go that deeply into a kind of sadomasochistic relationship, really.
Notorious had not yet been released when on the 5th of March 1946, Churchill declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The two new superpowers, the United States and Soviet Russia, were soon engaged in the Cold War. It lasted 40 years. In this balance of terror, what mattered was controlling the most sophisticated weapons available. German scientists found new employers in both the West and the East. Werner von Braun, creator of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which were so feared in England, became the leading figure in the US space program, NASA.
We go through the war fighting the good fight, and we believe in heroes. We believe in the justice of the war. But then very shortly after the war, the discovery of the camps, the demonstration of what the bomb is going to do to change everything, they teach us that there is a kind of deeper evil in mankind, or a more foreboding quality that will be much harder to escape and deal with than a just war. Life has suddenly got a lot more complicated.
I think the political view of this film, as much as in some respects it's a propagandistic film supporting the war effort, I think it's quite critical and quite controversial. He's certainly critical of the American government, the forces of good that are basically choosing as one of their main weapons prostituting a young woman. We think of the Nazis as being the fascists. Well, the Nazis had some comfort, and they had some allies, even among the allies. Now, certainly Hitchcock is not trying to suggest anything truly nefarious about the Washington officials. They are not Nazis, to be sure. But I think one of the most unlikable characters is the representative of Washington, the figure of Prescott. And I think Hitchcock had to be quite subtle in conveying that because the censors would not like that.
Claude Rains works for the chemical company, IG Farben, in the film. Hitler built Auschwitz for IG Farben. It was essentially a slave labor camp for the use of IG Farben. And IG Farben manufactured Zyklon B, which was the gas that was used to gas people in the death camps. Bad company.
Sebastian's house is a cover-up for whatever this Farben group's up to here in Rio. We've got to get Miss Huberman inside that house and find out what's going on there.
Something strange happened at the end of the war, and you can see this in a recent film of Steven Soderbergh, the good German. There was a new enemy, Russia, and suddenly Germany, IG Farben, Franco, all of these old enemies were suddenly a bulwark against communism. And so at some point in probably the late 40s, early 50s, the Farben references got cut out of the film and were only recently restored by Disney. It's in the film now. So the fate of Notorious really is typical of what happened in the transition from World War II into the Cold War.
In the 1960s, Hitchcock made two films about the Cold War, Torn Curtain and Topaz. But the subject of the conflict between the two powers proved uninspiring. Neither film had the vitality or complexity of Notorious. Hitchcock was reunited with Ingrid Bergman in Under Capricorn, and with Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief and North by Northwest. In 1955, now the most famous film director in the world, he was approached by the rising medium of television to produce a series called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. There were 265 episodes, 17 of them directed by Hitchcock himself. His last film was Family Plot, made in 1976. He died in 1980.
In 1979, my grandfather was given the Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Film Institute, and it was a bittersweet night. It was the end of his career, pretty much the end of his life almost, and Ingrid Bergman was the mistress of ceremonies for it. So they had the different tributes by everyone who had worked with him, and at the very end, and it was so touching, she thanked everyone for coming, and she said she had one more thing to tell, and anyone who was close to my grandfather called him Hitch or Hitchy. And she said, Hitch, I know you remember, obviously, the key of Notorious.
Well, you know what? Carrie stole that key after the scene. Yes, and he kept it. He kept it for about 10 years. And one day he put it in my hand and he said, I've kept this long enough. Now it's for you, for good luck. I have kept it for 20 years. And in this very same hand, there is the key.
And now she wanted to give it to Hitch, to give him many years of good luck. And she gave him the key. And someone said to Cary Grant, is that really the key? And he went, shrugging his shoulders.
C'est-à-dire que finalement, vous êtes surtout intéressé
You have taken a particular interest
en vous abritant derrière une histoire de caractère policier
in taking the framework of a police story,
à filmer des dilemmes moraux.
in filming moral dilemmas.
Sure, that's true.
Oui, ça c'est vrai.
Yeah, sure.
Ben, ça sera ma conclusion.
And that will be my conclusion.
Thank you.